Dredge is a video game created by the developers over at Black Salt Games and was released on March 30th, 2023. At its core, its premise sounds simple. You're the captain of a one-man seafaring boat, and your job is reeling in those scaly creatures of the deep and selling them to nearby ports. Sounds pretty simple, right? Okay, now add in the conspiracy-ridden tale of a 20th century town filled with supernatural secrets akin to the works of Edgar Allan Poe or H.P. Lovecraft, and you basically have Dredge. Now to be clear, this isn't a story premise on the level of Red Dead Redemption 2 or Soma in terms of depth or character development, but what it lacks in complexity, it makes up for in curiosity. Who doesn't want to reveal the horrors that lurk below the surface and find out what the hell is going on with these waterlogged towns? That's exactly why Dredge had me hooked. Equipped with nothing but your modest and mostly reliable fishing boat, you'll set sail in the open ocean to satisfy your curiosities as you make money and progress by catching a variety of fish and selling them in town. Along the way, you'll meet the memorable enough cast of sea-dwelling folk to push the story along towards a grand ending reveal. And boom, you've got an absolute banger of a game. I've heard some talk about Dredge potentially getting some mentions as Game of the Year, and I don't know about that, especially since Resident Evil 4 has been unleashed as furiously as it did back in 2005. Seriously, it's amazing, go play it. But even still, I wouldn't be surprised if Dredge gets nominated and wins in some categories, especially against other indie competitors. It's refreshingly great, and I think now is the time to issue my spoiler warnings. I'm going to be talking about the mechanics of this game and offer my critiques on them. I will also be discussing the elements of the story that tie directly to the gameplay. In my opinion, I think this game still can fully be enjoyed, even if you know what happens in the quests. It's not that detrimental that you would know them, but I will refrain from spoiling the specifics of the quest lines and characters, so you don't have to worry about those. But I will be talking about the characters in a general sense. And of course, you already know I'm going to talk about that ending. Dredge is $25 on Steam right now, and it took me exactly 18 hours to complete the main storyline, and I seriously recommend it. So there's the complimentary spoiler warning. Now let's set sail. So basically, you start out with an extremely limited fishing boat, and you're presented with the main port of the main town. Greater Morrow is the first landmass we become acquainted with, and it's also where we first enlist our services as fishermen. Like what you'd expect as you first come into town and start the game, there's a couple characters that teach you the basics of gameplay, such as fishing, selling, upgrading, etc. They also plant the murky seeds of the overarching storyline. You meet the fishmonger, which is basically the merchant, who looks like he himself actually was drug out from the tide. You keep coming back to him, as well as the shipwright NPC, who helps you upgrade your vessel. Also in town, there's the charismatic and controlling mayor, keeping a close eye on you, as well as the mysterious lighthouse keeper, who occasionally drop some cryptic lore and prophetic warning against the supernatural dangers of the Great Blue. They're a memorable cast, and I was concerned when I saw them, to be honest, because of their 2D style and lack of audio dialogue. It was a red flag to me of games that I usually don't enjoy, but the more I interacted with them and got used to the aesthetic of the world, the more I became comfortable with the style of how these human interactions are displayed. Sure, a larger company with more resources could probably spice things up with some voice acting and perhaps 3D models to accompany your experience, but I can still solidly say that I'm more than happy with the current design, given the circumstances. After wandering out a little ways and learning the art of reeling, you'll encounter another strange fellow known as the Collector. Living in a gothic, decrepitated mansion on the side of an island, the Collector reveals you to his occult pursuit of some mythical legendary items lost out at sea. He promises powers to your seafaring vessel, and you agree to help the Collector. Now the gameplay loop is set up. Go out, get the relics, sell some fish, get more and more power, and work towards completion, and figure out what the heck is going on with the story. Days will quickly turn to nights out at sea, and trust me, you don't want to be left out at night on the ocean. Deadly monstrosities will undoubtedly swallow you whole, and total your boat if you're not careful. This allows for some tense moments later on in the game, but the gameplay overall is simple. it's rewarding, and it's most importantly interesting. From then on, you're on your own to explore the spacious map and all its little secrets throughout. There are 5 main isles, or continents, for you to explore and complete. Each one of these does a great job of feeling fresh and unique and different. The Gale Cliffs has some sheer rocks and waterfalls. The Stellar Basin has a wonderful tropical scenery with unique fishes and wildlife. The Twisted Strand is a claustrophobic swampy region that houses a cool stranded soldier's quest. And lastly, there's the Devil's Spine Volcano, a ruin-filled island with some of the most treacherous obstacles of the entire game. Like I said, each island carries a unique atmosphere, with new things to find on each. The gameplay loop still remains essentially unchanged, but the change of scenery and NPCs do so much to keep things interesting the whole game. I love the questline from Stellar Basin involving a lone researcher trying to figure out how to subdue the giant tentacled monster lurking beneath the region. You help her collect certain samples, and she's able to do the necessary research to get her power station up and running again. That's the simplified version, of course. There's more threads to it. But all the islands have a main questline sort of similar to this one that balance these fishing mechanics with the questlines really nicely. Upon completion of each island's main questline, you'll get one of these sacred relics we talked about earlier, and you'll haul it back to the collector where he grants you some special power. I don't want to spoil them all. Some might say it's too simple, the gameplay loop, but I really like how you can approach the story with as much or as little care as you want, and still have a fun time. There's depth to the narrative to chew on and wonder over. But maybe you don't care about the specifics of the ancient lore of the islands, and you're just here to get a little scurvy while casting your net out at sea. And that's totally an option too in Dredge. You're never stuck in an annoying cutscene. You're never forced to listen to a character talk and share their story with you. You always just have the option to click right on through them. At the culmination of the collection of the items, aka the end of the game spoilers, you bring all the relics to the collector and he hops aboard onto your ship and asks you to travel on to the X on your map. The game tells you that everything after that point will not be saved, and that's when you know something big's about to go down. You set course to the marked location on your map. When the game's final scene occurs, the collector tosses the relics into the ocean while relaying his prophecy. Then a woman emerges from the water. What exactly is going on? It's still murky to me even now, but once the woman seems to be resurrected from the ocean's depths, a great eldritch horror rises aggressively out of the churning ocean in front of you with impressive scale. It looms over you, and presumably over all the greater Marrow's Island. Then the camera cuts to a scene showcasing the town set ablaze. And that's it. Now there is a secret ending I know of, which has a really cool revelation about the collector, and adds a different cinematic cutscene to the end of the game, but I'll leave that for those who want to uncover it themselves. I don't want to spoil everything. So the story is great and compelling, even though admittedly I don't really understand all the narrative threads that weave together or what really happens at the end, but the story felt right. And it seems like there's more there for those who particularly care to sink their hooks into. Lovecraftian themes are a perfect fit for a game like this because it elevates things from just basic fun fishing mechanics into a memorable tale to be remembered. It's not going to change your life, no, but I still really found it captivating, and I recommend it. The blend of horror and ocean exploration is something I want more of in this game and in any games, because I love when stories have dark undertones to them. In my personal opinion, an amazing video game doesn't force lore, explanations, and expositional dialogue down your throat, but instead lets you decipher things on your own terms. Dredge does that in a way where the story never feels like a hindrance or a roadblock. But the most important thing for me and my homies is the gameplay, which I'm excited to talk about now. What are the specifics of gameplay that seem to be so compelling? Dredge is great because it only takes 3 or 4 mechanics and fleshes these out to their fullest extent. I know you might say, only 4 mechanics? Sounds like they could get boring over the course of the 15 or 20 hours you might invest into the game. Well, not exactly. For what they're worth, I found a surprising amount of enjoyment in participating in the gameplay loops offered here. Even if on paper they look repetitive, in practice, I was completely fine with them. More on that later though. Let's talk specifics. There are 4 elements to the gameplay. Number 1, unsurprisingly, is fishing. Number 2, upgrading your boat. Number 3, exploration. And number 4 is completing the story, or quest lines you'll find out in the world. First off, the fishing mechanic is unlike other fishing minigames that I have seen in other titles. You might be familiar with the comparison of Red Dead Redemption 2, which has a pretty in-depth fishing system. Of course, in that game, you're mostly always standing on land or from a dock, fishing into lakes and rivers, and occasionally the ocean. But in that game, there's a back and forth of reeling and giving slack, using the right types of bait, and scouting out the proper location to cast your line. The more valuable the fish, the more difficult the task of reeling them in, which may take longer times and more precise reactions. Another famous game with fishing is Animal Crossing, which is less demanding mechanically, but still fulfilling because it has the awesome museum to show off your epic catches. Dredge, on the other hand, is honestly not what you'd probably expect. It's not similar to these examples I've just mentioned. All throughout the ocean, you can visibly see spots where groups of fishes are at. Once you sail your ship over to the desired fishing location and press F, a bright circular wheel appears on the left side of your screen next to your inventory. As the dial rotates, you're intended to click when the cursor is lined up with the green section. Successfully pulling off consecutive green interactions will land your scaly loot, but if you click interact on the red spots, you will not progress towards catching the fish, but you won't actually lose the fish off your line. At no point is it possible to lose a fish due to a skill diff. It simply resets your progress and gives you another chance. Perhaps if you're watching this gameplay, it might look kind of basic and not what you'd expect, but after spending time with it, my honest critique is that I think there's actually beauty in the simplicity here. There's a balance that has to be struck between actions you'll be doing hundreds of times over the course of the game, where the minigame has to not be a chore. If I had to constantly reel my mouse in like a circular motion 300 times, my wrists would be exhausted, and that would hinder my desire to play the game. The simplicity and accessibility is the key to a lot of the success Dredge has, because it lets you do more of what's fun and allows for the breathing room of the other mechanics. Another really fun part of the game is upgrading your trustworthy engine boat. In order to upgrade certain components of your boat, you have to collect certain scraps and gears and hand them over to the shipwright back in the main port. There's driftwood, metal gears, cloth, and large metal holes, which all piece together the recipes for your upgrades. You'll find pools of these materials out in the world, and they require a unique sort of Frogger-esque minigame to loot them. You're supposed to press F on your keyboard to move your dial to the column that's clear of gaps. If you're able to fill up the entire round time without hitting a gap, then you'll be rewarded with the corresponding treasure. That's one variation on the fishing minigame. For certain types of fish, there's another variation on the minigame where you have a spinning crosshair that you have to interact with at the exact right moment, which was the most difficult for me for some reason, maybe because I'm brain dead. The green line spins around at varying speeds, and you're supposed to interact when the line hovers over your turnstile. All of these little interactions you can play are somewhat basic, but I think there's a secret to why they always remain fun throughout the entire game. The secret is the automatic movement that catches your eye on screen. The rotation of the circle on the left side grabs your attention and retains you until you're granted with your reward. The movement in these little puzzles keeps the action flowing, or you'll never get petrified by frustration or confusion. For instance, if it was a stagnant puzzle, like another game, The Witness, a game chock full of hundreds of little puzzles, it would feel exhausting like that game does. I'm not a fan of that one, even though I know it has a cult following. The Witness is just not for me, because the core puzzles are so dry and lack engagement. Dredge's puzzles are a smashing success in comparison because of their flow and accessibility. The repetitions never become monotonous and chore-like. Another thing that keeps things from becoming terrible is the inclusion of the telescope. I didn't actually understand the appeal of this tool until later in the game, and you've already caught many types of fish. You see, from the surface, you can't see what type of loot lurks below you until you ride over and click on the dredging spot. At first, you're just trying to catch anything you can in order to gather resources and collect money. But later in the game, you are afforded some amount of selection and restriction to your finding. So by using the telescope, you can actually see from afar what type of fish is in a certain area of interest, so that you aren't wasting your time with fishes you don't want. Previously caught fish types will readily appear in your scope, and if you haven't caught the fish before, you can see an actual question marker on the fish grouping. This makes it easy to know if it's worth your time to stop or not at a specific location, which becomes very helpful in solving certain quest lines. Even after already completing 99% of the game, I still feel compelled whenever I drive past a group of fish just to try my hand at the minigame, just because it's really fun. That's it. It's that simple. To be completely fair, there at the end of the game, I did yearn for maybe a little bit more challenging puzzles, that perhaps were a culmination of all the skills I'd mastered. That's one of my critiques I would offer for Dredge. For instance, maybe you could have a puzzle that would have multiple layers of columns in the dredging minigame. You'd be able to move your dial closer to the center of the circle for faster completion, but obviously would ramp up the difficulty by dodging being faster and more intensive. Something like that would be welcomed to add some final spice to the game. But even still, these core gameplay mechanics were really good and kept me entertained. On top of all this, there's the next layer of the day and night cycle, which is where things get really interesting. You're always going to be out managing and looking out for the day and night. Like we've already discussed, the world gets very dangerous at nighttime, but also potentially rewarding if you're looking to catch the exclusive fish types only available at night. The risk of nighttime fishing is losing all your progress since your last visit to town if your ship gets destroyed by those ferocious sea monsters. At the beginning of the game, the nighttime is terrifying. You're physically and mentally left in the dark when it comes to what horrors are out there. In your first night, you'll probably see an animation of a dozen or so eyeballs watching you from afar, and it's truly nerve-wracking. Later in the game, you'll be dodging giant tentacles and weaving ghost ships in order to complete the orders of the island you're working on. There's a lot of creepy world events that can happen depending on where you're at, and they will keep you on the edge of your seat, especially if you've got your cargo hold full of valuable fish that you don't want to lose. These sea monsters are the most exciting part of the game, and I wish there were more and more of them to encounter. I don't want to spoil all the specifics of those horrible beasts, but you probably get my drift already. What's the point of fighting for your life and selling your precious loot if you've got nothing to spend them doubloons on? Well, that's exactly where your ship upgrades come in, like I was talking about. Crafting in the floating dock creates new additional equipment spaces, but cold hard cash is how you actually buy those machine upgrades. Right from the start of the game, you'll be taught from the shipwright that there's an intimidating amount of ways you can tinker with your boat in order to boost its powers. Part of the fun is deciding which upgrades are most important to you, and I'll try to break them down concisely right now. There's 4 upgrade tracks. First, the chain of upgrades that gradually increases the amount of storage your ship has as a whole. That becomes very useful when finding larger and larger fish out in the ocean, especially when they have very obtuse shapes. I'm talking about you, coastal freaking shark. I hate that thing. It should go without saying that the more fish you can hold at once, the more money you can bring back in whenever you sell them in town. The second upgrade chain allows for the brighter light sources, which makes it easier to avoid any treacherous rocks or sea beasts out there to get you. The way light works is pretty interesting because even though you can see pretty much everything on your screen, even at nighttime, you must have the light enabled to see rocks in front of you, even if they're only 1 foot away. So upgrading your light is very crucial, especially navigating the more treacherous landscapes later in the game, like the volcano island. The third quarter of the upgrading pathway is improving your actual fishing gear. Basically, the more powerful fishing rods and nets you have, the more space they're going to take up in your inventory. You're only able to put these special rods on the right and left sides of your ship, which makes sense, but in order to catch fish within a certain region, you have to have the correct fishing rod. There's oceanic, abyssal, shallow, coastal, volcanic, and mangrove fishing regions. The last upgrade pathway is my favorite because it makes your boat sail faster. Because I'm a stinking American idiot, my metrics are set to miles per hour, so I don't actually know how fast you're eventually going in kilometers or knots or anything. But regardless, I like going fast like Sonic. This is my favorite mechanic, probably because its difference is immediate and noticeable. The disparity of speeds between the start of the game and your endgame is like the difference of a goldfish and a great white shark. But Dredge balances this tightrope extraordinarily well. The gear never feels too underpowered or overpowered at any point in the game. Never at any time did I feel like I was going so slow that my time was being wasted, but I definitely still felt the incentives to make my ride sail quicker. That's a tough line to balance, but Dredge pulls it off with finesse. So throughout the entirety of the game, you'll be handling your cargo and fitting together the fishes, materials, and valuables in your inventory. It's basically a Tetris-style inventory game that's really similar to Resident Evil 4's loot management, and I guess the other Resident Evils too. But here, of course, instead of a shotgun, You've got your boat's headlights and some fishing poles. Oh yeah, I just remembered Resident Evil 4 has that fishing minigame too, now that I think about it. Anyways, I like how the actual inventory menu mimics the layout of the real boat. You've got your engine spots in the back, your fishing rods and nets on the port and starboard side. You like my little fishing terminology? And of course you've got your trusty headlights up in front. I appreciate these small details like this because they're definitely not necessary, but they add a sense of immersion to the gamey feel of things. These certain equipment items are only allowed to be placed on those respective spots, so basically they're hard locked in unless you want to uninstall them and replace them at the cost of precious time ticking away. The threat of time passing will often influence your decisions because every action causes time to pass at a heightened rate. Fishing does, dredging does, sailing does. All these cause time to speed up. So on top of all these smaller systems I've mentioned, you're always managing the overall ticking clock above your head. And that's why I kind of feel like Dredge is more of a real-time puzzle exploration game, maybe similar to Outer Wilds. I haven't played that game, instead of like an action combat adventure like you might expect. The intentional decisions you have to make will make the difference of you living or dying, and that's the fundamental backbone of Dredge's philosophy, and I love it as they've incorporated here. So Dredge is great. Yeah, I've already said so many awesome things about it. I already recommend it. You should buy it and play it. It's awesome. But I think we should still shift gears, and I will offer my complaints. Because gamers can never just be happy, can we? There's always something to improve, and I think that's honestly what makes these videos interesting. So, without further ado, let's talk critique. Like I mentioned earlier throughout the game, you visit different ports on the 5 different islands. Visit is almost an unfair word because you never actually set foot on land. Instead, you just connect to their pier. And I think it would be nice if you could physically walk around town in some sort of capacity. It would add some permanence and character to the places you visit and make the towns less of like this distant imagining of a place and turn it into like a real lived-in city. I know part of the story's identity is like being stranded out sea as a lone fisherman, but at the bare minimum, wouldn't it be awesome if I could build up my own little house on the side of an island where I could see my valuables inside or other catches I'm proud to show off? I'm thinking of something maybe like Mario Odyssey, where the top hat ship gradually becomes decorated with your own collectibles. That would be amazing to see, although it would take a lot of added mechanics to pull off. I only mention it because I think it would be worth it and it would add a lot to the game. In a similar vein, why can't I customize the appearance of my ship? It'd be great if I could at least paint it red so I can pay tribute to Wind Waker. I wouldn't think it would take like an enormous amount of development to add in some customizable cosmetic systems to my ship. And in my gaming experience, a little customization can go an extraordinarily long way into making the story my own. Another complaint I have is that the docking animation honestly just takes like 2 or 3 seconds too long. And I know that sounds kind of petty, but when you have to port like 1 billion times, those 5 seconds multiplied adds up. I think it'd be a great solution if the game added like a grapple hook upgrade that simply speeds up my landing. It'd be another slick thing to work toward, and its effect would be instant, much like upgrading the speed of my ship. Another complaint, I wish the various merchants were a little more expressive to the fishes I was selling them. And basically after the first island, the traveling merchants are the main place you'll visit to sell to. And even if you bring in a whopping full cargo's worth of salty prizes to them, they don't as much as blink an eye. Even a tiny little basic reaction to me bringing in a trophy fish worth $500 would feel great and act as a reinforcement that I accomplished something noteworthy. All these things probably sound petty and small, and that's because they honestly are. Dredge is a super solid game. Yeah, maybe I would have liked some bigger waves here and there, or maybe like a final boss fight would be really cool, but as a whole package, I really don't have anything to complain about with Dredge. The exclusion of these things I've just talked about really don't make the game much worse at the end of the day. And if they do, it's like a super small amount. That's not going to ruin your experience. So there's my critique. If you've watched this video and you still aren't sold that this game's up your alley, I will remind you that currently it's only $25 on Steam, and it sits at a 96% overwhelmingly positive player review. There's my critique. Was this game even on your radar? What did you like about Dredge the most? Have you even played it yet? We're gonna hear more about this at the end of the year, I'm sure, but for now, I certainly enjoyed my time with it. I try to put a lot of effort into crafting these videos into something people will enjoy, so please let me know if you like this critique. Pretty please subscribe so you're informed of my next in-depth critique that I'll be popping out. But that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and take care.